I don't know about you, but I cannot help but compare myself to other people. I think this was really driven home for me when I was at the mall with a friend. This was, I don't know, probably 20 years ago, back when people still went to malls. But we were walking in the mall, and he looked over at me and he said, "Why are you walking just a little bit faster than me?" And I genuinely hadn't even noticed it, but he was right. I was trying to make sure that I beat him. In what, you ask? Yeah, in nothing. In walking faster in the mall? That doesn't even make any sense. But I realized from that moment that I have this sort of innate desire to compete. I can turn anything into a competition. Certainly it happens when I'm driving on the road. It's also why I love games so much. But I find myself competing with other people in my mind all the time, wondering if I'm funnier or smarter or a better speaker or a better partner or a better, whatever. Anytime I'm in a place with any other people, I find myself comparing myself to them. And if I'm being really honest, it's never a positive experience. Comparing myself to other people is my kryptonite. It destroys my self-esteem. It turns other people in my perspective from being potential friends to competitors. And it's a really, really toxic trait. I have to say that in the last few years, as I've really settled into this truth, it's been incredibly freeing for me. This truth being that God doesn't expect me to be someone else. God expects me to be me. God created me in a unique way. And often all of those things about me that I think are silly or unlovable are actually things that God created and ways that God calls me to be in the world. So that's what I want to talk about today. And we're going to talk about it through this story that I hope you already read in John 21 of Peter and the beloved disciple having this encounter with the resurrected Jesus. It starts on, they're on a boat fishing, and Jesus comes to the edge of the lake, and he's, again, stranger off in the distance, and he says, throw the nets on the other side, and then they catch all these fish, and the beloved realizes that it must be Jesus, mainly because this was like a famous scene from early in the disciples' experience with Jesus. So, Jesus was like recreating a meet cute, and that's how the disciples knew, or that's how the beloved disciple knew that it was Jesus. And then Peter swims to the shore, and they have breakfast with Jesus. It's this cool scene. What happens next after that is where Peter has this private conversation with Jesus. And before we get into the meat of the conversation, I want to go back to that character of the beloved disciple, because he's a character who only shows up in John's gospel, and he only shows up in relationship to Peter. So the first time we see him is at the Last Supper in John 13, when he's sitting closer to Jesus than Peter. And in fact, at one point, Peter has to say, hey, what did Jesus say to you? And then relate it. After Jesus is arrested, Peter and the beloved disciple both follow Jesus's arresting entourage to the trial. That's where Peter denies that he even knows who Jesus is 3 times. In the meantime, the beloved actually goes in and watches Jesus' trial and follows Jesus to the cross. The beloved is there at the foot of the cross, where Peter is nowhere to be found. Then on Easter Sunday morning, when Mary finds that the tomb is empty, she goes and gets who? Peter and the beloved. They both go to the tomb, and it's the beloved who believes first that Jesus was raised from the dead, whereas it's Peter who has to go in and check things for himself. So constantly in the last part of John's gospel, Peter is being compared to the beloved, and he's constantly coming up short. I feel this deeply. It is an incredibly painful thing to read the passion narrative, the story of Jesus' arrest, death, and resurrection, and put myself in the shoes of Peter. I would much rather be the beloved, but I have to admit, I'm probably going to be the guy who's constantly coming up short. And so that brings us to this conversation that Jesus and Peter have. To this point, no one has mentioned, that Peter denied that he even knew Jesus 3 times. And then Jesus has this conversation where he says, hey, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yeah, of course I do. Jesus, we're boys, right? And then Jesus says, I want you to take care of my sheep. And then Jesus asks him the same question 2 more times. And if you read a bunch of commentaries, or you've maybe even heard some sermons where the various pastors and theologians pick at the different words for love, or he says sheep instead of lambs, and they try to make a big deal out of it, I honestly think that's sort of missing the forest for the trees. Because what's happening in a larger way is that 3 times Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, and 3 times Peter confesses that he does. And it's after the 3rd time that Peter realizes what Jesus is doing. he's naming Peter's betrayal, but he's doing it in a way that's restorative to Peter. He's inviting Peter not to live in the shame of his betrayal, but instead to own that and to grow and to learn from it. And then, in fact, Peter is entrusted with leadership in the church. It's an incredible moment that then gets immediately undercut because Peter looks back. They're like walking down the beach having this conversation, right? And then Peter looks back behind him and he sees that trailing a little ways behind is who? Of course, the beloved disciple. And then he says, well, what about him, Jesus? What's he going to do? And Jesus says a couple of weird things about like, well, what if I want him to be alive till we come back? Which really should make for a great speculative fiction series, but no one's written that yet. So there you go. Let me know. Just give me an acknowledgments credit if you do it. Anyway, what Jesus says to Peter is so incredibly freeing. He says, don't worry about him, Peter. You do you. You be the person that I created you to be. You be the person that God created Peter to be. Lead the way Peter leads. Which in the context of what we just experienced is with Peter's betrayal and all. I mean, can you imagine that Peter will ever think of his denial of Jesus the same way again? How can he possibly imagine that without also remembering that Jesus restored him and honored him and called him to lead in the face of his failure? One of my favorite pastors is a Catholic friar named Richard Rohr. And he has a great book called Falling Upward, which is sort of like a spirituality of failure. So for people like me, it's great. And he talks about the idea of Christian perfection or Christian holiness. And I love the way he inverts it here. So I just want to read this excerpt from Richard Rohr. He says, if there is such a thing as human perfection, it seems to emerge precisely from how we handle the imperfection that is everywhere, especially our own. What a clever place for God to hide holiness, so that only the humble and earnest will find it. A perfect person ends up being one who can consciously forgive and include imperfection, rather than the one who thinks they are totally above and beyond imperfection. A perfect person is one who can include and make room for imperfection, not the person who thinks they're above it. What a different way for people of faith to believe and to behave. Not as people who demand flawlessness, but as people who make allowances for us all to be who we were created to be, and for us to grow together, and for us to learn together. It's a powerful image of who the church can be. And it comes not from the beloved, the guy who always did everything right, but from Peter, the one who messed up, the one who failed, the one who always spoke before he thought. If Peter is the leader of the church, then there's hope for me and there's hope for you. Isn't that good news?